May 7, 1945. The war in Europe is hours from ending. In a requisitioned mansion in Regensburg, Germany, General George S. Patton sits alone at a long oak table, a glass of whiskey untouched beside his hand, staring at a map of Eastern Europe. Every other general on the Allied side is preparing to celebrate. Patton is preparing for something else entirely, because on that map, he sees what almost no one else in the American High Command is willing to say out loud, that the armies rolling in from the east are not allies. They are the next enemy, and within days, he will begin saying it. To reporters, to congressmen, to Eisenhower's face, he will call the Soviets a menace. He will propose, in private conversations that made his own staff officers go pale, that the United States rearm defeated German soldiers and drive the Red Army back to the Volga, while the American war machine is still hot. He will say things so explosive that Washington will scramble to contain him, and 7 months later, stripped of his army, exiled to a paper command, his voice finally muzzled, George Patton will be dead on a hospital bed in Heidelberg, his neck broken in a low-speed car accident so strange that people are still arguing about it 80 years later. This is the story of what Patton actually believed about the Soviet Union, why those beliefs terrified his own government more than they terrified Moscow, and how the loudest general in the American army was systematically, deliberately, silenced in the last year of his life. To understand why Patton saw the Soviets the way he did, you have to understand that his hatred of communism was not born in 1945. It was decades old, and it was personal. In 1919, as a young officer fresh from the First World War, Patton had watched the Russian Civil War from afar with something close to horror. He read the reports of the Cheka, the mass executions, the deliberate starvation campaigns. While most American officers filed Russia away as a distant chaos, Patton filed it away as a warning. He was a man who believed history moved in cycles of conquest, and he became convinced, long before Hitler ever took power, that Bolshevism was not a political system but a conquering religion, one that would never stop at its own borders. So when the United States found itself allied with Stalin in 1941, Patton swallowed it the way a soldier swallows an order he despises. He fought the war he was given, but he never, not for one day, stopped believing that the alliance was a temporary marriage between enemies who would eventually turn on each other. What changed in 1945 was that Patton finally saw the Red Army up close, and what he saw confirmed every fear he had carried for 25 years. As Third Army pushed into Czechoslovakia and Austria in the final weeks of the war, Patton's forward units began encountering Soviet troops, and behind them, the refugees. Tens of thousands of them, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, ethnic Germans, all fleeing west, all telling the same stories. Looting on an industrial scale, mass rape, entire towns stripped of everything from factory machinery to doorknobs, loaded onto trains, and shipped east. Patton's intelligence officers documented it. His medical units treated the survivors, and Patton, a man who had seen the worst of 2 world wars, wrote in his diary that the Soviets were, in his words, a scourge, that their behavior toward civilians was that of conquerors from another century, and that Western leaders who thought they could be reasoned with were fooling themselves. Then came the moment that turned private conviction into open confrontation. In early May 1945, Patton's Third Army stood on the doorstep of Prague. The Czech resistance had risen up against the German garrison and was being slaughtered in the streets, broadcasting desperate radio appeals for the Americans to come. Patton's tanks were 40 miles away. 40 miles. He could have been in the city in a day. He begged Eisenhower for permission to take Prague, and the answer came back, no. The demarcation lines had already been agreed with Moscow. Prague was to be liberated by the Red Army, not by George Patton. So Third Army halted on the Karlovy-Vary-Plzeň line, and Patton sat in his headquarters, listening to the radio traffic as the uprising bled, waiting for Soviet forces that arrived days later, and stayed for 44 years. For Patton, this was not a strategic footnote. It was a betrayal of everything the war had supposedly been fought for. He had watched American policy hand an entire nation to the very system he believed America would eventually have to fight, and he began to say so. At first, he said it in private, to his staff, to visiting generals. To Robert Patterson, the Under-Secretary of War, Patton reportedly argued that the moment of maximum American leverage was right now, that the United States had the greatest army in its history sitting in the middle of Europe, supplied, blooded, and victorious, and that in a year it would be demobilized and gone, while the Red Army would still be there. His logic was brutally simple. If a confrontation with the Soviet Union was inevitable, and Patton was certain it was, then fighting it in 1945, with veteran divisions and total air supremacy, was infinitely better than fighting it in 1955 against a rebuilt and possibly atomic Soviet Union. He even floated the idea that shocked people most of all, that surrendered German units, the Wehrmacht soldiers now sitting in American POW cages, could be rearmed and used as manpower. To Patton, this was cold arithmetic. The Germans knew how to fight the Russians, and they were already there. To almost everyone who heard him say it, it was political dynamite. The American public had just sacrificed 400,000 sons to destroy the German army. The idea of re-equipping it weeks after VE Day was not just unthinkable, it was the kind of statement that could end a career if it ever reached a newspaper. And Patton knew it. That's the part of this story that gets lost. He wasn't naive. He wrote to his wife Beatrice that summer that he understood exactly what he was doing to his own future. But something had shifted in him after the German surrender. The war that had defined his entire existence was over. He had told friends for years that he hoped to die with the last bullet of the last battle. Instead, he was alive, 59 years old, and watching what he considered the fruits of victory being handed away at conference tables. A man who no longer fears for his career is a dangerous man to manage, and Washington was about to find out just how dangerous. Through the summer of 1945, Patton served as military governor of Bavaria, and it was here that the collision finally happened in public. His assignment was denazification, the systematic removal of former Nazi Party members from every position of authority in German civil life. And Patton, to put it bluntly, thought the policy as written was madness. Not because he had any sympathy for Nazism as an ideology. His diaries from this period are full of contempt for the German leadership, and he had personally forced German civilians to walk through the liberated camp at Ohrdruf so they could never claim they hadn't known. His objection was practical, and it was strategic. Bavaria was starving. Winter was coming. The people who knew how to run the water systems, the railways, the power plants, and the local governments had almost all been nominal party members, because under the Third Reich, you often couldn't hold such jobs without joining. Fire them all, Patton argued, and you get chaos. And chaos, in Patton's mind, was exactly what communism fed on. He was convinced that a shattered, ungoverned Germany would fall to Soviet influence, and that every administrative collapse in the American zone was a gift to Moscow. So he dragged his feet. He kept experienced administrators in place, and reporters noticed. On September 22, 1945, at a press conference in Bad Tölz, it all detonated. Pressed by correspondents about why former Nazis remained in Bavarian administrative posts, Patton, tired, dismissive, and fatally unguarded, compared the situation to ordinary politics back home, suggesting the Nazi question was being treated like a fight between Democrats and Republicans. Within hours, the quote was on wires around the world. Within days, it was a firestorm. Here was America's most famous fighting general appearing to trivialize Nazism itself. What the public didn't see was the context that Patton's defenders would argue about for decades, that his real preoccupation, the thing driving every decision he made in Bavaria, was the Soviet threat, and that he viewed denazification policy through that single lens. But context doesn't survive a headline. Eisenhower, already exhausted by years of cleaning up Patton's public statements, summoned him to Frankfurt on September 28th. The meeting behind those closed doors was, by every account, brutal. And when it ended, George Patton had been relieved of command of the Third Army, the army he had built, the army he had driven across France. the army that was his identity in human form. Now here is where the word silenced stops being a metaphor, because what happened next was not a firing, it was a burial. Patton was transferred to command the 15th Army, and the 15th Army was not an army at all. It was a small headquarters staff in Bad Nauheim assigned to write the history of the European campaign, a paper command, a library with a general attached to it. Think about what that assignment actually meant. The most aggressive field commander in American history, the man whose entire philosophy was speed and violence and forward motion, was given a desk and a stack of documents and told to spend his days summarizing a war that was already over. His press access evaporated. His policy influence went to zero. His warnings about the Soviet Union, which had been inconvenient when he commanded 400,000 men, became irrelevant when he commanded file clerks. Whether or not anyone in Washington ever spoke the words out loud, the effect was unmistakable. Patton had been removed from every position where his voice could shape events. And privately, he was done pretending. His letters and diary entries from October and November 1945 are astonishing to read, because the filter is completely gone. He wrote that he believed the war had been won on the battlefield and lost at the conference table. He raged against what he saw as the appeasement of Stalin at Yalta and Potsdam. He told confidants that he intended to resign his commission, not retire, but resign, deliberately giving up his pension and his uniform so that he would be free to speak as a private citizen. He planned to go home in December, spend Christmas with Beatrice, and then begin saying publicly, on the record, with the full weight of his fame behind it, everything he had been muzzled for saying in Germany. Understand what that would have meant in December 1945. Patton was one of the most famous men in America, a national hero with a hero's audience, no longer bound by army regulations, planning what amounted to a one-man campaign to convince the American public that their gallant Soviet ally was in fact their next great enemy. 2 full years before the Truman Doctrine, before the Berlin blockade, before the phrase Cold War meant anything to an ordinary American. He would have been either dismissed as a warmonger or hailed as a prophet, possibly both. We will never know which, because he never made it home. December 9, 1945. Patton's last full day of duty in Europe was supposed to be spent hunting pheasant near Mannheim. He rode in the back seat of a 1938 Cadillac limousine with his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay. On a quiet stretch of road outside the city, an army truck ahead of them turned unexpectedly. The Cadillac's driver braked. The collision, when it came, was almost gentle, a low-speed impact that left every other person in both vehicles essentially unhurt. Every person except one. Patton, who had been looking out the window, was thrown forward, striking his head. He knew immediately something was catastrophically wrong. He told Gay he couldn't feel his hands. The impact had fractured his neck and severed function below it. The man who had survived machine gun fire in the First World War, who had ridden in open cars through artillery barrages across 2 continents, who had cheated death so many times his soldiers half believed he was protected by fate itself, was paralyzed from the neck down by a fender bender on his way to shoot birds. For 12 days he lay in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, and even now, even paralyzed, the man's character blazed through. Doctors were stunned by his composure. He joked with the staff. He asked clinically detailed questions about his own spinal injury. Beatrice flew from the United States and read to him at his bedside. There were moments of genuine hope, small returns of sensation, talk of eventually moving him home. Then, on December 21, 1945, a pulmonary embolism reached his lungs, and George Smith Patton Jr. died in his sleep. He was buried, at his family's request, not in America but at the American Military Cemetery in Ham, Luxembourg, laid at the head of the graves of Third Army soldiers, facing his men, as if still leading them. The general who wanted to die with the last bullet of the last battle, instead died in a hospital bed, silenced weeks before he planned to make himself impossible to silence. And of course, that timing is exactly why the questions started, and why they have never fully stopped. A famous general, at war with his own government's policy, weeks away from resigning to launch a public crusade against the Soviet Union, dies in a freak low-speed accident in which no one else is seriously injured. Over the decades, books and documentaries have spun that coincidence into full-blown assassination theories, implicating everyone from Soviet intelligence to elements of America's own security apparatus. And here is where honesty matters more than drama. No credible evidence has ever established that Patton's death was anything other than what it appeared to be: a tragic, stupid, ordinary road accident, the kind that kills people every day precisely because it seems too minor to be deadly. The historical record supports misfortune, not murder, but the reason the theories persist is itself revealing. They persist because the metaphorical silencing was absolutely real. Patton had been stripped of his army for his views. He had been shunted into a powerless post because of his views. His warnings about Soviet intentions had been treated as an embarrassment to be managed rather than an assessment to be weighed. The accident may have been fate. The muzzle was policy. And that leaves us with the final, uncomfortable question, the one Washington never had to answer because Patton didn't live to force it. Was he right? Within 18 months of his death, the wartime alliance he had called a fiction was in open collapse. Within 3 years, Soviet forces blockaded Berlin, and the West mounted an airlift to keep 2 million people alive. Within 4, the nations Patton had watched fall behind the demarcation lines, including Czechoslovakia, including the Prague he had been forbidden to save, were locked inside a block that would hold them for nearly half a century. The Cold War that America's leaders in 1945 refused to anticipate became the defining conflict of the age. Patton's proposed remedy, confronting the Red Army in 1945, rearming German soldiers, fighting the next war before the current one had even cooled, remains as horrifying to contemplate now as it was then. A course that could have ignited a third world war among exhausted nations and shattered continents. History does not vindicate his solution, but history vindicated his diagnosis with almost cruel speed. The general they silenced for calling the Soviet Union the next enemy lived just long enough to be punished for saying it, and died 2 years too soon to hear his own country finally admit it. In the end, George Patton lost his army, his command, and his voice, not because he was wrong about the world that was coming. He lost them because he saw it too clearly, said it too loudly, and said it first. But the full story of that silencing deserves to be told slowly, because it did not happen in a single press conference or a single meeting in Frankfurt. It happened in layers, over months, in whispered phone calls and carefully worded cables, and it began long before the first reporter ever wrote down a careless Patton quote. To see it clearly, you have to go back past the surrender, past the champagne, all the way to a bridge over the Elbe River in the last week of April 1945, when American and Soviet soldiers met for the first time and the whole world celebrated a handshake that Patton refused to trust. The photographs from Torgau became instantly famous. Young GIs and young Red Army men grinning at each other across a broken bridge, trading watches and cigarettes, two armies that had crushed the Third Reich between them like a walnut. In London and Washington and Moscow, that handshake was presented as the image of the new world. Allies forever, the great powers united. Patton looked at those same photographs and saw something entirely different. He saw the front line of the next war being drawn in real time. While official communiques spoke of eternal friendship, Patton's own intelligence sections were quietly compiling a very different picture from the ground. Soviet units were not behaving like liberators in the territories they occupied. They were dismantling entire industrial regions and shipping them east as spoils. They were installing political officers in every town hall. They were arresting non-communist resistance leaders, the very people who had fought the Nazis, within days of arriving. Patton read those reports every morning with his coffee, and every morning his conviction hardened. This was not an ally winding down a war. This was an empire consolidating a conquest. And then he met them face to face. In the summer of 1945, Patton traveled to Berlin for ceremonies marking the Allied occupation of the German capital, and what happened there has passed into legend among the men who witnessed it. At one gathering, a senior Soviet officer sent an interpreter across the room to invite Patton to share a drink. Patton's reply, delivered with a smile so cold the interpreter reportedly hesitated to translate it, was an insult so blunt and so profane that it stunned everyone within earshot. And the Soviet general, when he finally heard it, is said to have laughed and declared that he liked this American, because at last one of them was speaking honestly. On another occasion, standing beside Marshal Zhukov himself as massive Soviet tanks rolled past in review, Patton listened to the marshal boast about the range of a new Soviet gun and answered in essence that if any of his men opened fire from that distance, he would have them court-martialed for cowardice. The Soviets remembered him after that. In Moscow's assessment of the Western generals, most were politicians in uniform. Patton was the one they marked down as an enemy. He would have considered it the finest compliment of his career. What Patton could not do in Berlin, however, was change a single line of policy, because the policy had already been written, and it had been written at the very top. At Yalta in February and at Potsdam in July, the shape of post-war Europe was fixed by men negotiating over maps, and Patton was not in the room. He was never going to be in the room. He was a weapon, not a diplomat, and everyone in Washington knew it. But here is the detail that history often skips. Patton actually attended parts of the Potsdam period as a decorated observer, close enough to watch the machinery of accommodation grind forward, close enough to hear the reasoning, that America needed Soviet help against Japan, that the public would never support a confrontation, that Stalin's promises about free elections in Eastern Europe had to be taken at face value, because the alternative was unthinkable. Patton listened to all of it and wrote in his diary, in language he never intended to be polite, that the West was giving away the victory. He believed the atomic bomb, tested that very July, changed everything, that America now held leverage no nation in history had ever possessed, and was choosing not to use even the shadow of it at the bargaining table. To Patton, this wasn't caution. It was surrender on the installment plan. By August, the pressure inside him was becoming visible to everyone around him. His aides noticed it. His old friends noticed it. Dwight Eisenhower, who had known Patton for 25 years, who had protected him through the slapping scandals of Sicily and the firestorm over his remarks in England, noticed it most of all. The two men had one of the strangest friendships in American military history. Eisenhower, the younger officer, who had risen to command his former mentor; Patton, the volatile genius, who owed his continued career almost entirely to Eisenhower's patience. Through the war, that patience had held because Patton delivered victories no one else could deliver. But the war was over now. The equation had changed. A Patton who could win battles was indispensable. A Patton who could only make headlines was a liability. And in the summer of 1945, headlines were the only battlefield left. The situation in Bavaria gave those headlines their fuel. Patton's occupation zone was, by any honest measure, a disaster area, not because of his administration, but because of the war itself. Millions of displaced persons churned across the landscape. Cities lay in rubble. The coming winter threatened famine and epidemic, and into this chaos came directives from above, demanding the immediate purge of every former Nazi Party member from every position of responsibility, no matter how minor, no matter how technical. Patton complied on paper and resisted in practice, and his reasoning, recorded again and again in his letters, always circled back to the same fixed point. A collapsed Germany serves Moscow. Every train that failed to run, every power station that went dark, every town council that dissolved into paralysis, was, in his mind, another crack for communism to seep through. He was not alone in this analysis. Within 3 years it would become official American policy, the very foundation of the effort to rebuild West Germany as a bulwark. But in the summer of 1945, saying it out loud was heresy, and Patton was constitutionally incapable of not saying things out loud. There was another storm gathering that summer, one that cast a genuine shadow over Patton's record and gave his critics real ammunition. Conditions in the displaced persons camps under his jurisdiction, including camps holding Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, were investigated that August by a special envoy, and the resulting report to President Truman was scathing. The findings landed on Eisenhower's desk like a bomb, and Eisenhower personally toured camps in Patton's zone in September, and what he saw left him furious. Patton's private writings from this period contain passages about the survivors that are ugly to read and impossible to defend, and honest history has to say so plainly. The man who saw the Soviet threat with prophetic clarity could be shockingly blind, even callous, in other directions. By mid-September 1945, then, Eisenhower's frustration with Patton was no longer about a single issue. It was an accumulation: the DP camps, the denazification foot-dragging, the anti-Soviet outbursts, the sense that the most famous general in the American zone was fighting his own government's entire post-war design. All that was needed was a spark. And on September 22nd, in the press room at Bad Tölz, a reporter struck it. The question itself was almost routine. Correspondents had been pressing for weeks about former party members still holding administrative posts in Bavaria, and on this particular morning, one of them asked, in effect, why the military government was keeping Nazis in office. Patton was tired. He had been fielding versions of this question all summer, and he considered it a distortion of a complicated reality. And so he reached for a comparison he thought would make the situation sound ordinary and manageable, and instead handed his enemies the single most destructive sentence of his career, likening the Nazi Party question to the routine tug-of-war between America's own political parties. He almost certainly meant that most rank-and-file membership had been careerist conformity rather than fanaticism. What the world heard was America's greatest general shrugging at Nazism itself, 4 months after the liberation of the camps. The wire services had it within hours. By the next morning, it was being read aloud in editorial meetings from New York to Moscow, and Soviet propaganda outlets, with undisguised delight, began holding Patton up as proof that fascist sympathies lived on in the American command. The general who wanted to warn the world about Stalin had just become Stalin's favorite talking point. What followed was a week of slow-motion collapse. Eisenhower's headquarters demanded a clarification, and Patton gave one, a second press conference in which he tried to walk the statement back, insisting his words had been twisted, reaffirming his commitment to the denazification program. It changed nothing. The political damage in Washington was already terminal. On September 28th, Patton was summoned to Eisenhower's headquarters in Frankfurt, and the meeting that took place there lasted the better part of 2 hours behind a closed door. No stenographer recorded it, but officers waiting outside later described what they could hear through that door. Voices raised to a pitch neither man's staff had ever heard between them. Two old friends, tearing at each other over everything the past 6 months had built up. When the door finally opened, the decision was made, though it would be announced with face-saving choreography. Patton would leave Third Army. Officially, it was framed as a transfer suited to his talents. Privately, every officer in the European theater understood exactly what it was. On October 7, 1945, in a ceremony at Bad Tölz, Patton formally handed Third Army to General Lucien Truscott. Witnesses remembered that his voice, usually a parade ground instrument, faltered as he spoke his farewell to the colors. He told the assembled men, in words that cut deeper than anyone realized at the time, that all good things must come to an end, and that the best thing that had ever happened to him was the honor of commanding the Third Army. Then he walked out of the headquarters he had made famous, and out of operational command, forever. The weeks at Bad Nauheim that followed are the strangest chapter of Patton's entire life, because for the first time since 1940, nothing around him moved. The 15th Army headquarters occupied a quiet spa-town hotel, and its mission, compiling the theater's operational history, required of its commander almost nothing at all. Patton signed papers, he reviewed drafts, he took long rides, and in the silence, he planned. His letters home from October and November read like a man methodically preparing a campaign, because that is exactly what they were. He set his departure for December. He intended to spend Christmas at home in Massachusetts for the first time in years. And then he told Beatrice and a handful of trusted friends, he would settle the question of his future once and for all, and every signal he gave pointed the same direction, toward resignation rather than retirement, toward the freedom of a private citizen with a public following, toward speeches and writing and a fight he could finally wage without a censor. Some around him worried he might be drawn toward politics. Others believed he simply wanted the right to tell the truth as he saw it about the Soviet Union and about the decisions of 1945. What no one doubted was that George Patton unmuzzled would be a national event. In November, he wrote passages in his diary that read, in hindsight, almost unbearably, reflections on how little he had left to do in the army, how the great days were behind him, how a man ought not to outlive his usefulness. He was 59 years old, in robust health, and speaking like a man closing accounts. December 9th was meant to be a small pleasure before the voyage home, a day's pheasant hunting in the countryside near Mannheim with Hobart Gay, his chief of staff and one of his oldest comrades. The morning was cold and gray. The Cadillac rolled out early, driven by a 19-year-old private first class named Horace Woodring, with a jeep ahead, carrying the hunting dogs and gear. Along the way, Patton did something entirely in character. He stopped the car to walk through the ruins of a Roman outpost by the roadside, standing in the frost among stones laid down by another empire's soldiers 18 centuries before, talking about how armies rise and vanish. Then they drove on. They paused at a railway crossing to let a train pass, and a few minutes later, on a straight, unremarkable stretch of road on the edge of Mannheim, a 2.5-ton army truck coming from the opposite direction swung left without warning, turning toward a depot entrance directly across the Cadillac's path. Woodring braked hard. The speeds involved were modest. This was no highway catastrophe, just two vehicles meeting at an angle at perhaps 30 miles an hour. The Cadillac's front end crumpled against the truck. Woodring was unhurt. Gay was unhurt. The truck's occupants were unhurt. But Patton, seated in the rear and turned to look at something out the window at the moment of impact, was hurled forward against the interior of the car, striking his head with terrible precision. He did not lose consciousness. That is the detail that haunts everyone who reads the accounts. He was awake, lucid, bleeding from a gash on his scalp, and within seconds he understood the truth before any doctor said it. He told Gay he was having trouble breathing. Then he asked the question, calmly, that no one in the car wanted to answer. He could not move his fingers, and he wanted to know why. And then, according to Gay, he said the sentence that has echoed down through every account of that morning, that this was a hell of a way to die. He was not dead, though. Not yet. At the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, doctors confirmed what Patton already knew: fractures of the cervical vertebrae, a spinal cord catastrophically damaged, paralysis from the neck down. The Army responded with everything it had. One of the finest neurosurgeons available, Colonel Glenn Sperling, was rushed to Germany. Beatrice Patton crossed the Atlantic and was at her husband's bedside within days, and from then on she rarely left it, reading to him for hours from the military histories he loved. The treatment itself was medieval in its cruelty, traction applied through hooks set into the bones of his face to immobilize and align the shattered neck, and Patton endured it with a composure that awed his doctors. He demanded honest answers about his condition, and when Sperling gave them, straight and unvarnished, Patton thanked him for it and asked, soldier to soldier, what his chances were of ever being anything more than an invalid. The answers were not good, and he knew it. Yet there were days of real hope. Slight sensation returned in places. Plans were drawn to fly him home to a hospital in the United States. The newspapers, which had spent September savaging him, now carried daily bulletins on his condition, and letters poured into Heidelberg from ordinary Americans by the thousands. Whatever Washington thought of Patton, the public had already decided. This was their general, and they wanted him back. He almost made it. The flight home was being arranged for the following week, when, on December 21st, the failing systems of an immobilized body did what they so often do. A clot traveled to his lungs. He had spent that day quietly, had spoken with Beatrice, had drifted into sleep in the early evening, And in that sleep, without struggle, without an audience, without anything resembling the thunderous exit he had imagined for himself, across 4 decades of soldiering, George Patton died. The men of his old headquarters wept when the news reached Bad Nauheim. Woodring, the young driver, would carry the grief of that morning for the rest of his long life, though no one, not the army, not the Patton family, not Patton himself in his final days, ever held him at fault. On Christmas Eve, in a cold rain, a funeral train delivered the general to the American military cemetery at Ham, in Luxembourg, ground soaked with the blood of his own Third Army from the Bulge. Beatrice had answered the question of where he should lie, with a single sentence that ended all discussion: he should be buried with his men. And so he was, his white cross set at their head, positioned as if forever leading the formation, a commander whose last posting would be permanent. The theories began almost immediately, and in a way, they were inevitable. The mathematics of suspicion were simply too neat. A general who had spent 6 months at war with Soviet interests and with his own government's policy, days from sailing home to begin an unrestrained public campaign, killed by a freak accident in which he was the only casualty. Over the following decades, the speculation grew baroque. In the late 1970s, a former wartime operative came forward claiming secret knowledge of a plot, and books and films have periodically revived the idea ever since, pointing to the vanished wreck of the Cadillac, the sparse official accident documentation, the convenience of the timing. And so it must be said again, clearly, because sensationalism is easy and honesty is not. No verifiable evidence has ever substantiated any of it. The dramatic confessions came decades later from sources with every incentive to embellish and no documents to show. Investigators and serious historians who have examined the case have consistently arrived at the duller, sadder truth, that low-speed collisions kill people in exactly this way, with grim regularity, that record-keeping in the chaotic occupation zone was sloppy about far more than one car crash, and that George Patton was killed by a moment's bad luck on a wet German road. The conspiracy theories endure not because the evidence supports them, but because the story feels like it should end that way. Because everyone can sense that powerful people were genuinely relieved when Patton's voice went silent, and the human mind struggles to accept that relief and guilt are not the same thing. What cannot be disputed, what the documents prove beyond any argument, is how fast the world proved him right. Less than 2 months after Patton's burial, an American diplomat in Moscow named George Kennan sat down and composed the famous Long Telegram, a cable to Washington arguing that the Soviet Union was inherently expansionist and could only be met with firm, patient resistance, an analysis that would become the intellectual foundation of containment, and that restated, in polished diplomatic prose, almost exactly what Patton had been bellowing across dinner tables for a year. 2 weeks after that, Winston Churchill stood on a stage in Fulton, Missouri, with the President of the United States sitting behind him, and told the world that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, from the Baltic to the Adriatic, trapping the ancient capitals of the East behind it. The phrase electrified the planet. Patton had been relieved of his command for expressing the same essential judgment in rougher words 14 months earlier, and in February 1948, communist forces seized total power in Czechoslovakia in a swift, ruthless coup, and Prague, the city Patton's tanks could have reached in a single day's drive in May 1945, the city he had begged to liberate, vanished behind the curtain for 41 years. Somewhere in those years, one imagines, more than a few of the men who had signed off on halting Third Army at the Pilsen line found themselves remembering the profane, impossible, insufferable general who had told them exactly what was coming. That is the true weight of this story, the thing that lingers after the conspiracy theories are set aside and the myths are trimmed back to the record. George Patton was a deeply flawed man, arrogant, reckless with his words, capable of cruelty and of prejudices that stain his legacy. And his proposed cure for the Soviet threat was a fever dream that could have incinerated an exhausted world. But on the central strategic question of 1945, The question every wise and careful man around him got wrong, the loud, undiplomatic, unmanageable cavalryman got it right. He saw that the handshake at Torgau was an armistice, not a friendship. He saw that the armies facing each other across the Elbe would face each other for a generation. He saw the Cold War coming while the men who governed him were still toasting eternal alliance, and for the crime of seeing it, they took his army, took his platform, and filed him away in a spa town to write history instead of making it. Fate did the rest on a road outside Mannheim, and so the general lies at Ham among his soldiers, facing east toward the lines he was never allowed to cross, silenced in every way a man can be silenced, except one. Because 80 years later, we are still telling the story. And the story ends the same way every time. They stopped him from saying it. They could not stop it from being true.